Ministério do Turismo e Associação Casa Azul apresentam 18ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. O projeto se beneficia da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura, Vale Mais Cultura e conta com o patrocínio oficial do Itaú. Apoio da Prefeitura Municipal de Paraty, Pinheiro Neto Advogados e UOL. Realização: Associação Casa Azul, Secretaria Especial de Cultura, Ministério do Turismo, Pátria Amada Brasil, Governo Federal.
Boa tarde a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marília Neustein.
Hoje é um dia muito feliz.
Today is a happy day for Instituto Brasil-Israel to participate in the International Literature Festivity in Paraty. I'm very happy to introducing and present this table with three giants that are the Israel, Ayelet Gundar-Goshen, and you have Adriana Carranca and Maria Laura Neves that will be the mediators. We are doing a very important work here in Brazil with this complexity of debates in this relation with Brazil-Israel. So welcome to have these experiences about love and war. You're going to be a very profitable conversations. I introduce our mediator that I'm very fond of, Maria Laura Neves. She's journalist. She is specialized in human rights, is a militant of the rights of women. Now she is Marie Claire magazine. She's chief editor and has this right of the human struggle and has national international award and Valdemir Herzog award, very important in the press area. And you have Revista Cláudia and Época magazine, and she is doing master degree in sustainability in Getúlio Vargas Foundations and mother of two beautiful kids that I am lucky to get to know. And I have Maria Laura that will talk about that, right? Marília, thank you very much. Thank you for Brasil-Israel Institute for the opportunity to mediate these conversations between two beautiful women that I admire, that I have been learning a lot. And I had this Ayelet and Adriana, I had the opportunity to have them in my life professionally. I will start contextualize and tell them the story and the curriculum that are outstanding of their curriculum. Ayelet is a degree in clinical psychology from University of Tel Aviv and worked as journalist, and Adriana and I, and she has scripts and awards international festivals, and she writes books and scripts in Israel and the cinema of Israel. She gives lessons in the University of Tel Aviv and in technological University. Her script has won award international festivals, including the Berlin Today Award and the New York City Short Film Festival Award. One Night Markovitch, his first novel, won the Sapir Prize for Best Debut. It was translated in 13 languages. In that moment, a man was married, Jewish man got married to Jewish woman to go to Palestine and to be away of the Nazism. Yakov Markovic, which is a monotonous man, was the most beautiful woman he got married to and didn't want to give the divorce when he got to the Palestine. This is what was arranged. And then you have all the drama, and I am not going to tell, otherwise I would have the spoiler to you. It is based on a true story. It was published in 2018 when Ayelet was with us in Flip, in a very productive and beautiful table. This is the second novel, The Awakening of a Lions. It was translated in 30 languages. It was launched in Brazil last year. It's a suspense of moral dilemmas and a doctor in a professional crisis. And the context was that. And you have an immigrant from Eritrea and didn't give help. This immigrant had a car accident by this man. And there was a kind of unfolding of a story like this. You have a lion, Leah, and we don't have translation in Portuguese. Talks about a story of a girl that say a bad lie. She's a liar, and it talks about the story. And Adriana is a journalist that had humanitarian crisis and human rights, and throughout her career, she has this eye of gender, and she had a conflict in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and it's such a long list that she covered war conflicts. She had the attack by the Islamic State against the base where she was in Iraq. So all her work gave her many journalistic awards. Among them, it was the ESSO Award, the most important award of the press in Brazil. And she is working in Globo, CBN, Estado de São Paulo newspapers. And she has Malala that wanted to go to school. It has the editor Companhia das Letrinhas and had two ESSO Brazil awards. It was translated in Spanish and it is published in Portugal. She had the Jabuti Award in Afghanistan and then Taliban. Adriana is graduated in journalism and has a social politics in master degree in London School in Social Economics. And if it is a girl, it is a documentary. It was adolescents involved with crimes in São Paulo. She had this follow-up with these girls for 7 years. And she is a photographer, and it was in Kabul. And one of these photos was Humanizing Developing Campaign. So what puts these two girls together, this outstanding curriculum, is to have the eye of the daily lives, of the intimacy and subjectivity in this context of conflict. I have the dynamic here that you had in the previous tables. You have one question for each of them, and then you have questions and answers and the audience questions. So keep your questions in your platforms where you are seeing the video. Let's start. Ayelet, I will start with you. You are our international guest. Once in an interview, you said that what happened to Bella, it would happen because the society was concerned about major and external issues, the formation of the state. I would like to hear from you the story that gave the life of the book, the real story, and the situation of the human, and how do you think that the discussions of the private themes have these problems with these acute situations in the society? Do you think they have the second place in the society in crisis moment or not?
A gente não está te ouvindo, Ayelet.
Before I will answer the question, I will say hello and boa tarde, and that I'm very happy to be there in Brazil and here in Israel at the same time. I think the one good thing I can find in this situation of the COVID and the pandemic is the idea that you can talk to people sitting in one side of the globus and communicate with people on the other side of the ocean, and to talk about literature, even in very difficult times as the times we're facing right now. I think for me, this is a moment of hope when you see that even though the global crisis is going on, people still fight to be able to meet and to communicate together about literature, about words, about civil rights. And coming back to my novel, To One Night Markovich, the character of Bella, the woman, she's based on a real story, on a real event that actually happened. And this event was that just before Second World War, when it already started, but before the big concentration camp, before the Shoah became to its fully grown, Jewish women were still allowed to leave Europe if they were married to somebody who had a foreign citizenship. And so a group of men that were living in Israel at the time left Israel and sailed on a boat to Europe in order to marry Jewish women and in this way get them out of Nazi Europe. So these women were supposed to marry men that they never met before and to be married to them just in order to escape the danger of the Nazis. But what happened in at least one case that I heard about, and later after I finished the novel, I heard there are many other cases. What happened was that, at least in one case, there was a woman that got married to a man in order to escape Nazi Europe. She got to Israel and she was supposed to get divorced from this man. But the man fell so deeply and madly in love with her that once they reached Israel, he refused to let her go. And this is the story of Bella. And when I heard the story, the real Bella, the real woman, her name was not Bella, but I changed it. The real woman was already very, very old woman. And the man who did this to her had already passed away. But she was married to him for more than 40 years. She was married to a man that she did not choose, that she did not want to be married to him, that she was supposed to be married to him for 20 days just for the journey and then get divorced. But he held on to her by the power of his own private obsession, but also by the power of religious Jewish law. Because by religious Jewish law, by the halakha, which is the old ancient laws of Jewish religion, if a man and a woman get married, they cannot have a divorce unless the man gives the woman something called a get. A get is the permission of the man for the woman to walk away from him. And if the man refuses to give the woman a get, she cannot get divorced. And this is not just the 40s of the 20th centuries. This is the case in Israel until this very day. If a woman gets married in Israel, a Jewish woman gets married in Israel, and wants to divorce her husband, she must have the husband's permission. If there is no permission, they cannot have a divorce. And if she will go on and want to marry somebody else, she can't marry somebody else, because we do not have civil marriage right now in Israel. And if she will have the child of somebody else, the child will be referred by the Jewish law as a bastard and won't be able to get married under the Jewish law. And as a woman, as a Jewish woman living today in Israel, I found this idea to be shocking, that the woman is like the property of the husband. In Hebrew, in my language, when you say husband, Baal in Hebrew, the word Baal means owner, not just the husband, but the owner of the woman. So in One Night Markovitch, Bella thinks that she's going to be rescued from Nazi Europe, but she soon finds out that she has escaped one prisoner, the Nazi guards, but now she's in a different sort of jail. She's in the jail of being married to somebody that she doesn't want to be married to. And when I sat down to write this novel, I actually didn't think about Bella. I thought about the man who did this to her. I thought about Yaakov Malkovich. Because when I first heard the story, I thought, what a terrible person can do such a thing. What kind of a man can go all the way to Europe to save a woman, to rescue a woman from the Nazi rulers, and then go there to save a woman and end up being the guard who keeps her in jail her entire life. And I heard the story, it's a real story that happened. And when I heard it, my first reaction, being a woman, was thinking that this man is a terrible person, that he is a villain, that he's a monster. I thought of him as a monster. But then I thought, I'm a clinical psychologist. So I thought, it's too easy to call this person a monster. It's too easy to say he's just a terrible person, he's a villain, or to say this is patriarchy, or this is terrible chauvinist laws. Because when you do this, you're saying something very truthful in the political way of thinking, but you don't go into the roots of this in the psychological aspect of it. You don't ask yourself, how come our world is shaped in this way? If we want to change the way our world is shaped, we first have to understand the powers that made it be this way from the beginning. So I looked at Yaakov Malkovich and I thought, I don't want him to be the symbol of patriarchy. I don't want him to be the symbol of the chauvinist pig, because this is not literature. This is real life, but this is not literature. I don't want him to be a villain. I want him to be a person that we can identify. I want, as a woman, to be able to write his character in a way that I will feel just as much compassion for him as I feel for the character of the woman, as I feel for Bella. I don't want to have a monster and the beauty captive. I want to have two people, a man and a woman, two Homo sapiens, one man and one woman, and to show what can people do to one another, not out of evil, but out of pain. Because I think most of the terrible things that people do to other people is not necessarily driven by hate or evil motivations. I think most of the terrible things that people do to other people is motivated by fear, is motivated by feeling hurt, by feeling unseen. I think sometimes people feel that their only way of being seen by somebody else is to force him by force to look at you. And when I sat down to write the story of One Night Markovitch, I thought, I know how much I care for Bella, but I want to care for Markovitch just as well. And so I thought about how a man like him, the most neglected men, the kind of people that you won't remember their name 2 minutes after you met them. You just forget their name, you forget their face. What will happen to somebody like this if he will marry the most beautiful woman in the world? And how easily people can get confused between love and obsession. We teach our kids, I think from a very early age, that when a woman says no, she actually means yes. I think you see it in so many songs, so many TV shows, films, stories. Think about the prince and the frog. Do you have this in Brazil, the story, the princess and the frog? You know it, this one? So the princess and the frog. Okay, so the princess, the frog forces her to marry him because he helped her get back her golden ball. And she doesn't want to marry him, but her father forces her to because she made a promise. And then when we tell our children the story, we actually tell them, yes, a woman should stay married to somebody if she thinks he's a frog. Because even if you think he's a frog, if you'll only love him enough, he will transform into a prince. And we say it to girls, I think, all the time. If you don't feel comfortable in a situation, it's about you. You have to be more tolerant. You have to be more nice. You have to be more convenient to other people. And then this frog will turn out to be the prince. I think this is the kid's story, which is actually a story about arranged marriage across the world. The idea that if the princess will only lower her ego and give away her pride, then she will learn to love the frog. And Malkovich feels like a frog. And he hates this woman because she sees him as a frog and not as a prince. And he holds her by force. He holds her by the law, by the Jewish law, because he believes that if he will just hold her long enough, she will open her eyes and see something. And when I wrote this novel, I was also thinking about the idea of Israel and Palestine, and the idea that we have one piece of land that both Israelis and Palestinians are struggling over, and how easily somebody can hold on to a piece of land and say, I'm holding on to this piece of land out of love. But maybe we're sometimes confusing between love and obsession, between holding on to something because you care about it, and between holding on to something because you're full of fear and you're just afraid to let go. And I think this delicate distinction in private life between love and obsession, but also in the national level between love and obsession. For me, not just as a woman, but also as an Israeli, I think it's a very important distinction. And I think sometimes we get it mixed up, and a lot of the pain we're causing to other people in our marriage, but also in the national level right now with the Palestinian people, I think has to do with this, with separating between the two of them.
Muito bonito, obrigada.
Very beautiful what you said. Thank you.
Adriana.
Obrigada a você.
Adriana,
Você cobriu
we covered many conflicts. You went through extreme situations in many places of the planet. I would like to hear from you, going back to the private life and daily life. We have the impression when you are out of a place, when you see the views, that you suspend the life, that a conflict zone, you don't have love, you don't have passion, you don't have jealousy, you don't have regretting, and the private life does not happen. I would like to hear from you about your experience in relation to that, especially because you are a woman and you could go to the places of these people where the women can go into. So I'd like to hear from you about to be a woman and a journalist in a situation, how you can have advantages and drawbacks, and your experiences in your private and daily lives and the affections. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation of Instituto Brasil-Israel, Marília, Neves, that I worked for a long time in Estadão, my great colleague and confidant in our work, Maria Laura, for being the mediator, Ayelet, for the generosity of being with us, discussing this theme that is so important and so sensitive as well. And you brought in this introduction many elements that I could realize in the field doing these trips. I would like to have a first story as you are talking about love. So how was the first contact with Middle East? First, I started covering violence here in Brazil, human violence, and violence among youth, prison violence that you have here in Brazil. And in a moment, I thought that I had to go into depth about the history of violence and understand this phenomenon of violence, why it happens. What I talked a bit before me, and not always when I was interviewing young people involved with the criminality and the traffic dealing, you can see that these reactions was not guided by hatred, but sometimes by not being seen. It's very strong. This is something that Ayelet said. And she's talking about Israel, and it's the same dynamics here in Brazil. I thought that I had to understand more about this process as the violence takes place. And we have one people involved, the other one is not involved. What's the difference that Brazil has compared with the other places else? And then I went to study. I did a master's degree that Maria Laura said in the beginning in the Economy School of London, in the Department of Social Economy, where you have Fabiana, social political department, and I thought that I would have a base to study it. And then we were six scholars of 45 countries, so it opened my mind to the diversity of culture and religions and ways of thinking. And within these boxes that you see Jewish people, Muslim people, Christian people, you have evangelical, Catholic people, to talk about the little boxes of the religions. You have other boxes. You have the gender boxes and nationality boxes, but to talk about the religion. So within the little box that you try to put people, and you see how diverse people are. And many times they are not just one thing. They do not have just one thing that will define them. With these experiences in the springtime holiday, I was a very great friend. She was Egyptian, Muslim woman to go to Egypt to go to find a husband that the parents had three options. So she wanted my opinion to choose one of the three. She wanted our opinion as friends, and she was in her 20s. She was economist independent, was single, doing a master's degree, and even though she accepted because it was part of her tradition, she didn't see this as a contradiction, the culture. This practice of the parents is to choose the husband that she had to get married. She saw that's the way it is, it's natural. And her mother would have more conditions to choose because her mother had more experience. She was very calm about that. We were shocked. And for us, it was a wake-up call to me to say it's an alert. Our vision, in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, we always look with our eyes, with the cultural future and our experience and future. And many times, what really fascinates me in these trips is when I am challenged to change my eyes, that I think it's 100% sure and it's not. So I went to Egypt that I am Catholic. Now I have no religion because I cover religion, and I decided not to have religion until that is Jewish, Canadian Jewish and British, and Geraldine, Protestant and Philippine, to help Dina, Muslim Egyptians to choose the husband. And then it was the first moment that I saw how love, when the relationship, when you start from a connection, emotional connection, and all these walls and boxes that we create and the politics create and the leaders of the countries put to manipulate people, they vanish. When you were there, when the young men are really trying to fascinate these Egyptian women, it was not an imposed marriage, right? She has no obligation to get married, but she accepted to really have these husbands as, for example, we as friends, we are the guests, so we went to the best restaurants in Egypt because they would show to us as friends that they are the best husband for the friend, and you would go to have a discussion with the parents, and four of us were in the bedroom, in this private room. In Cairo, we were only four girls talking about what women and men talk all over the planet about relationships, future, whatever. Many themes, work, life, where you should live, how you should live. So there was no difference among us. And it was a big lesson to me in this first moment in the Middle East, going to this Middle East with a conflict places where people hate you in that time. That it was a vision that I had. It was distorted as a Brazilian living so far away from this reality. And it really opened my view. She decided not to get married to none of this. She got married in a sambão, in a samba show in Guanabara house. I don't know if you have in London. He was Egyptian, and the family members liked. I was the best friend, and in the marriage of Dina, I went to Iran because in that time it was Ahmadinejad, and you had a discussion about the nuclear power plant in Iran. And I went to Iran with the idea of a place that it was distracted by the war, with a lot of bitterness in the place, with radical people, a place full of hatred and very hostile against Americans or foreigners or West people, and a place that many things are imposed and in law. In Iran, by law, you have to cover yourself with the hijab, that is the veil that the Iranian Irish woman has to do it, even if you are a foreigner. When you are in the aerospace in Iran, you have the board. Uh, Aboard, you say cover yourself. And before I went to Arab Emirates and I went to a shopping mall to get to know the hijabi, and it was a very interesting conversation in that moment because you had three women that use a niqab, that the Arab women use like a burqa, that you have only the eyes. And I invited her to have coffee with me to get to know more about this reality. And I remembered that among a lot of things you talked about, I had this question. Is it true that in Brazil you have a lot of plastic? And in that time, yes, I think we are the first or the second country in plastic. And it said, this is oppression. You have to have a surgery to please the society or please your man. This is oppression. I do not have to do this because I use unicab. I was shocked. It was another light that I said, that's it. So what for me, it was oppression. That was to use these vests. For her was a way of freedom within these cultures. And what I could see as freedom is to go to the beach and where what I have wanted. It was like oppression because you know that there is this type of demanding society on the beautiful aspect of it. You have a lot of discussions about that, how the female newspapers and magazines and Mary Clay is changing in this process. To have the woman in a real way, not as something that is not achievable at all. So it was curious to see that. So she gave me a black veil, and I was afraid of going to Iran. I had a very bad image about Iran, and I covered myself totally. And I had the translator, the woman, and in Iran, all the journalists have to have the translator of the government. And obviously, it's not acceptable because you never know if the translator is translating what the people are saying, right? So what I did, I lied. I should haven't said this publicly, but I lied to say that I did speak English, and the government translator said I'm Brazilian. I can only speak Portuguese that is close to Spanish, and they said to have a student of Spanish from Tehran University that was an incredible lady. And I told, I arranged with her to go to the airport. I was all in black, all covered. And when I was in the airport, I see this lady with our star, the pink our star, and all make with makeup. Oh, mother said, "What are you doing? All covered." And they said, you Irish women are modern. And she took off my veil and he went and you got into the car, have a Iranian flag to the center of Tehran. So we had other experiences that you had there in Iran. This is the reality that Ayelet said. The divorce, only the man can give a divorce to a woman. But I'm very glad to see that people, when they are being oppressed and under conflict, they find ways that is very creative to survive to all of that. These are the stories that I try to find in the field. As Ayelet said, It's easy to say that you have hatred, that this person is full of hate. When you describe this stereotype that people know, you have more clicks, more news, but it does not explain anything. So I was trying to find the mechanism of people. And I remember that I was in Tehran, and I have some time, right? Just to tell this story, and then you open for questions, and Maria Lara can continue. I see a taxi going, and the driver was a woman. Can you imagine a taxi driven by a woman? And I had to go to Shirin Abadin, that is a peace Nobel woman. And I went to this taxi driver with Magenê, and she was obliged to get married. The father demanded her to do so. She was 12, very close to Bella, to be obliged to live with this man. She had 2 kids with this man, and she got married even before menstruated herself. And she was living with this man for 2 decades, more than 20 years. And you had many attempts to go out of this situation, of that prison that it was the marriage, as Ayelet said, in Israel. And in the Muslim world, only the man can provide the divorce to the woman. And she created a strategy that it was pretend she was crazy. And when she was at home with him, he said she was saying something. She was saying, "I'm seeing waterfall." You know, she started to mix up and to pretend she was crazy, nuts, going nuts to have the divorce. And it happened. She had the divorces, but the children are with the father. So she went to Tehran. She lost everything, the house, the children. She went to Tehran, was hidden in a friend's house, a woman. You know, the separated women, they are not uh, with a good reputation at all. And she had this cooperation of a tax, and she could buy the house and the children. And she was living by herself in Tehran with her son, and was a partner and associate with this taxi driver. 900 taxi driver that are driven by women. So only have women as the people that they conduct. So they help these ladies not to have any kind of harassment or whatever. So you could really put these walls of prejudice out of our ways that you have in Middle East, and the understanding how complex we are. Wow, incredible stories. Going back to the conversation that you had about love and obsession, and the parallel you had with Yaakov and Israel. There are some interviews, people ask you what kind of a diagnosis you give to Israel if it was your patient, and you say that it's a patient that suffers from post-traumatic stress. The question is, how would be this treatment? And I would like to hear from you about the importance of this trauma in your generations and the future generations. Is there an attempt or a kind of detachment of this trauma? Do you think that people are getting away from this trauma? This trauma can be something intergenerational, I think?
Eu acho que isso, precisa soltar o microfone.
I think it's a very good question, and I do believe that the trauma can transfer between generations. not just in the Jewish state, not just in Israel. I think every nation carries on its shoulder the weight of the past, the narratives that we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from, and also the hidden narratives, the things that we refuse to acknowledge and to face in the history of our nation. Just as you have it in families, just like you can transmit a trauma inside a family from one generation to another, through the stories, the narrative of the family of who we are, but also through all the things that we try to hide, but they always come out in the. So I think when it comes to the Jewish people, I remember, I think I was a very young girl when I first heard the story of the Shoah, and when I first saw the pictures, and then when I realized that the people who died there died because they were people like me. This is something that we tell our children in Israel from a very, very young age. So when kids are 6 years old, they cannot watch violence in the TV yet. You will never let them see an adult movie when they are 6 years old. But when they will go to school in the Shoah Day, in the Memorial Day, they will see terrible pictures that you will never let a 6 years old see these pictures in any other situation. But we do let them see the pictures in this situation of knowing who you are and where you came from. And I think that through the education system, because we want to keep the memory alive, we also pay a price for that, because we keep the memory alive, but we also keep the trauma alive in a way. And we have kids. I remember there was a very interesting psychological research about children's daydreaming. What do little kids daydream about? And they did it across many cultures to see what do kids daydream about. So if it was a kid in New York, then he would daydream that he is Spider-Man. And if it was a kid somewhere else, he would daydream that he's a cowboy. So most of the kids, their daydreams would be about beating the bad guys. But for Israeli kids, the daydreaming was, how would I survive if I was in the Holocaust? So it's not a daydream of how will I be the hero. It's a daydream of how will I survive if I was again a victim. And I think for me, when I read this research, I was shocked, because I remember this daydreaming, thinking, how would I survive if I was put in Auschwitz? And then I realized that it wasn't me. It's the daydreaming of a generation, that instead of daydreaming about how would I don't know, beat Darth Vader or Lord Voldemort or whatever bad guy you have in films or in literature, you daydream about how will I not be a victim again. And I think this comes back to the idea of the post-traumatic stress disorder, of PTSD, as a nationwide phenomenon. The idea that your nation experienced something that was so unbearable, and then you keep feeling like this trauma is repeating itself, because in PTSD, one of the most important syndromes is the idea that the trauma is invasive to your everyday life. You can walk in the street and suddenly you have flashbacks, or you have the irrational fear that it will happen again. And so you look at contemporary world through the eyes of the past. You're haunted by the past. You cannot meet your reality, because what you actually meet is the fears of the past again and again and again. And I think quite often this is what happens to us when we look at the Palestinians. You hear very often in the Israeli politics this comparisons between the Palestinians and the Nazis. Many people in the right will say they're like the Nazis. And I think they're not really like the Nazis, but we are so haunted by the idea that it will happen to us again, that we don't really see the people that we're dealing with right now. We see our own fears projected into today's life. And I think one of the things you try to do with a post-traumatic patient, and one of the things that you should try to do with a post-traumatic nation, is to repeatedly try to remind the person the difference between back then and right now, between the past and the present, and to try to widen up the narrative so that it won't be the same narrative of victimhood again and again and again. And the idea that you're not necessarily, the fact that you were a victim once, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll always be a victim. It also doesn't necessarily mean that the only way to avoid being a victim is becoming a predator. Because I think very often we see, you can see it with kids that were beaten, that they very often grow up to be beating parents themselves, because you don't want to be this weak kid anymore. You would do everything you can not to feel weak again. And one of the best ways of not feeling weak is to bully somebody else. And I think this is something that you see in the individual level, but you can also see it in the national level right now in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
E como você vê isso com a sua
And
geração?
how do you see in your generation, in the future generations, how they are behaving?
I think it's interesting, you know, because I have two little kids. So one is 6 and one is 4. And I'm thinking that right now, they're still completely unaware of two things. One is they don't understand that they're Jewish. We celebrate Hanukkah now, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. They know the holiday, but they don't understand the idea that this is a Jewish holiday and that somebody doesn't celebrate this holiday and does celebrate a different holiday, because they live in a very homogenic place. So they only see Jews around them. So they don't know yet that they're Jewish. And I'm thinking, how long will it be before they know that they are part of a group that was executed? How long? Because I remember the first time I saw swastika, and the first time I realized the idea that some people don't like me just because I'm Jewish. I also remember that in a certain age, I realized that some people think I can't do things just because I'm a woman, I'm a girl. So my girl is 6 years old. She doesn't know yet, I think, that people think that she's less intelligent or less sophisticated because she's a girl. She doesn't know yet that people think that she's ruling the world or that she's greedy because she's a Jew. And she doesn't know yet that the Arab language that she's learning right now in preschool, she doesn't know that this is the language of people that she's supposed to automatically hate because they're Arabs. She doesn't know these 3 things. And I wonder if we'll meet again a year from now in the next Flip Festival, if by the age of 7, she will already think of Palestinians as enemies, of being a woman as something inferior, and of being Jewish as something that carries the smell of trauma, past trauma, and maybe a future trauma.
Ok. Adriana, continuando pouco.
Adriana, continuing in this parallel between the intimacy life and the private life and the big issues and the conflict resolutions. Before this table, we are talking about how you change the world, not only in the public sphere. And you talked about that Malala story, and I would like to know the origin of your book. The story of Malala as a character that can change the world does not happen in the crisis, but when her father decided to enroll her in the school in the same way as the boys. And in your story, which examples you had in your life as a journalist, as a reporter, that can corroborate this thesis?
história da
I would like
Ayelet.
to go back to Ayelet's story just to answer, because I had the experience of the other side, that is the Gaza Strip, that the majority of the Jewish people do not have access. And after Israel went to the Gaza Strip, to say to Ayelet that I was in a family that had 3 girls and less than 10 years old. And I remembered when I was going to the border, Ayman, the translator, called me, said, I am ashamed to say that, but if you can bring, I know that is complicated because maybe you cannot go in the Gaza Strip, but if you can, wow, I asked, what? I thought, what he's asking to do. He wanted to have a wine and beer because he was married in Israeli restaurants to really cheer with his wife that would be forbidden in Gaza Strip. Because it's forbidden to have alcohol there, and it's still there. So would be the marriage, and they would like to revisit this time. So I got the wines when I was in the Hamas security. They saw, what's this? I said, it's my own consumption. And they thought, wow, this crazy woman likes to drink. A Brazilian woman can have alcohol, cannot be without it. So you had a very pleasant evenings with the families to see the places that they like to go in Israel. And what happened to their kids, the daughters, because of this blockade, they have no idea what Israel is all about or what is a Jewish person all about. And it is really influenced by a propaganda of Hamas that controls the schools, and so radical Hamas, because they do not know who the people who are in the other border side, in the other side of the border. This is a big mistake, because you have a generation and future generations growing without knowing the reality, being bombarded about the enemies, that the Israelis are enemies, that they want to kill the Palestinians, they want their lands, our lands. So you can see in the children this vision completely distorted. In the case of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, you have a different access, but in Gaza Strip, you see a completely different and distorted vision in the public school, especially. They have this distortion in terms of the neighbor on the other side of the border. It has to do with Ayelet is talking about this propaganda. As she said, Gaza Strip has a situation of a post-traumatic stress disorder and the lack of contact with the reality of the world outside there. People have this susceptibility to have a radical discourse input. And Malala, I went there because I had done the coverage in the war of Afghanistan, the frontier. I've been there for some times, and in Pakistan to have refugee camp stories, and I knew about her stories. So I went there when you knew about the fight against her by the Taliban. And the editor for the Companhia das Letras said, don't you want to have the impact of the War of the Women? Do you like to write a book? I thought it was incredible. So I said, let's go there. And it was a tense situation. You have the army that had the area under control. And you didn't know about the attacks, what was going on. The situation was tense. And when I went to this Malala world, it was in the middle of mountains, in the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They have a pasuk, the people, and they have the region called Pastunistan. And it was a region full of stories, warrior people that suffered many invasions. They had three British invasions, and they overcome all these invasions to have different types of guns. People of the mountain, they have only the oral language until 15th centuries. They are great storytellers. They really pass their experiences through storytelling. They have the ethical code passed on orally that has never been written. It is passed orally among generations. And when I get to Swat Valley and I go to school, and I saw the school, they had 900 schools, children, that you had a kind of a plantation of Malalas. You can see girls in the surrounding, that it was very poor, that had many invasions of war, and they couldn't develop, very radicalized by invasions that never had to do with them. They were invaded. So you could see this trauma, this stress post-traumatic disorder, but it was like oasis, that school. And you had clearly the transformative educational power in place, how education is an equality tool, even if you are so isolated and you are speaking in a language that nobody speaks, so radical, so poor. Malala, when he suffers the fight, she had the mic, and she had the knowledge of the world through books. He has never been out of that place. And in this moment of the war, she had a visibility that she didn't choose for that. And she was really Malala. In the following day, she was the Nobel Prize lady. She was there in a hospital in England by herself, and she couldn't speak, and the doctor gave there with the letter so she could express, and the first word is father. She would like to know about her father. So the trauma of this lady, this young lady, and the Zaudin guilt, because it was accused by Zaudin in this valley, because he was the one that allowed her to go beyond the limits imposed in that region. And with all this context, I was willing to write for children, because Ayelet can tell more about that. That is the confirmation bias. We adults have this confirmation bias. Things that you think it's very painful to change our opinions. You see a lot in conflict zones. It's more painful to change opinion or to believe that in this narrative that you were told all your life. And there, I decided to really write for children, because the children are open. As Ayelet was talking about the children, her children, they do not know about the reality. So they are open to accept any information. And I decided to write for children to see the power of education and the books. And many times, because of these storytellings of princess and heroes, you have to have supernatural powers. But the world changed when the private space at home, the father decided to give the same right to the girl. Even Malala was not famous. Even Malala, who didn't know how good the world was good for her, because she had a father that could educate her. as a daughter and would inspire the other parents. We can change the world every single day with one decision at a time. The way that you have a relationship with our neighborhood, community, city, country, and then the planet.
Que lindo.
So beautiful. So, my next question is for you two, ladies. You brought here and you dedicate yourselves and you brought to these debates many information, analysis, and stories that really touches our confirmation bias and this view of the planet, it's binary or established the way that you do. And my question is, Adriana, in a more journalistic way, I let more in the fiction. What is the role of the narratives in the conflict resolutions in your point of views? You can start with Ayelet. Ayelet.
I think for me, narratives are sometimes more important than the real fact when it comes to how a conflict evolves and also to how to finish a conflict. I think it's not necessarily what happened as it is what we tell ourselves that happened. How the narrative that we create shapes the way we act, our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, so much to such extent that sometimes the narrative is based on nothing and yet it can shape our entire lives. I'm thinking about there's the Gay de Maupassant story, the necklace. I don't know how it's called in Portuguese. A story by a French author called Maupassant, a short story called The Necklace. It's a story about a girl who borrows her friend's necklace, and she's so jealous of her friend, and she really admires the friend's chic. And then she loses the necklace, and she's sure that the necklace was a real one because she admires the friend so much. And then she goes and she buys a real necklace instead. And she spends her entire life working to pay out the debt for the necklace that she bought. And only in the end of the novel, after she lived her entire life paying the debt for this diamond necklace, she meets the friend, and the friend tells her, you look terrible. You look like you've been through a terrible life. And she said, well, I've been working so hard to pay back for the necklace. Now I can tell you that I lost your necklace and I bought you a replication and it cost me my entire life. And her friend tells her, but it wasn't a real necklace from the beginning. And I think this happens to us so often with narratives, that the narrative of the real necklace makes us act in the real life. And sometimes years later, we find out that it wasn't a real necklace from the beginning, but we lived our entire life thinking that it was. I think it happens to nations. This is history book. You open a history book and this is what you see. You read the different narratives and you think, wow, we could avoid a war if those people would just read the book that explains the different narratives instead of going to a war and then writing the book. And I think it happens to us in our daily lives again and again. People come to therapy because they've been telling themselves one narrative about their life, and they try to see if maybe they can tell a different story, a story that will make them feel better or behave better or change everything. And so for me, not just as an author, but I think also as a reader, I feel that stories, some books that I read changed my life far more than things that actually happened to me, because the narratives in them touched something in my soul that was in a way more important than what really happened in my life at the time.
Muito bom. Obrigada. Adriana?
Excellent. Thank you. I agree with Ayelet. In my case, is a non-fiction journalist and writer. I deal with the fact. fake news. We are talking about the disinformation, fake news. What is fact? Who decides what the fact is? And I always say that the fact, you talk about this. You can have your opinion, but not your fact. But it's more than that, because the fact is not that thing itself. You have a past that made this fact, and you have the future, the impact of that fact, and this past and this future that took this fact to take place, that you cannot deny at all. You have many narratives, because it is seen by many eyes and is experienced by many ways. The impact, for example, my book about Afghanistan, and so you have 11 Afghan men, and you have 11 of September. And why? Because I realize that you read a lot about September 11 by the views of the Americans, by the optics of the American. But the fact is the same. September 11th is the same. But what led this fact to happen and the impact that it was afterwards is completely different from the view of the Americans and the view of the Afghans. And in the Afghans' point of view, you have 11 stories that it was the woman that had the heritage. You have Marshall Fahim, that it was the opposition side, it was the vice president. It was the opposition. He was the opposition against the Taliban. He was from the Taliks, and you had the woman that it was a victim of the first attempt to suicide bomb, because it was not a Afghan tradition. It was seen, suicide is seen by the suicide as something, as a sin. They had difficulties. It was very difficult after war that you had the first attempt by these young Afghan that was victim, and she was a victim, and she lost her husband. She was not illiterate. She didn't know who was the president of the United States, didn't know about September 11th, didn't know about the United States, why they had a war in the country that she lived. And there was a journalist. So you have 11 stories, and the last one is the story of the new generations, the young Afghans that wanted to leave this trauma aside that comes from the Soviet Union war. They want to rebuild the country, and look ahead, not look behind. So you see that the same narrative of the stories starts with the fact that is September 11th, but they have different perspectives and experiences, and what kind of experiences you had with that fact. So I try to have this in my stories. Of course, in a newspaper is not, I'm not able to do this, so I do this through books to put this in a context that I find important. And going back to what we said in the beginning, it's easier when you talk about violence and war. You have to reinforce this stereotype and narratives that exists already, and they have more acceptance of the readers, because we are confirming what they know, almost the thing of the confirmation bias that I said before, how it make you suffer, how you can really challenge your narrative. But I think it's very important that you can have this narrative challenged by us. As Ayelet said in the beginning, if you simply see the fact only, not the way that you have the context and the complexity of the human beings, not one thing or the other, you are going to lose the capacity of seeing the other, or any way that could be pacific. You have to understand. I had an interview to the chief of the Taliban that it was responsible of the security in the Bin Laden area. When you had September 11th, a lot of Katilas, the name of the place. And I remembered that I had in my head, in my mind, because you have a baby, a baby is not ISIS or whatever, or Taliban. Something happened to that person to get to that point and become a Taliban. And my interest in the narrative is to tell this story. Everything that involves the development of a person for the good aspect or the bad aspect. Another example that you talked about, Maria Laura, was the Mauricio Lima's picture. I remember that I was back from Syria, or going back to Syria, or going to Syria, I don't remember. And Maurice asked for suggestions because he was in Syria before. And you have the narrative that the ISIS had to pass as narratives, the monsters. It was so easy to go and reinforce this stereotype. But you had so much complex things behind this phenomenon, this propaganda. What ISIS was doing was a propaganda in their own benefits, the way that they could become stronger because they were not militarily stronger. So I see this picture of Mauricio Lima, that it was a boy with all the body burned and a Kurdish soldier treating this burden of this boy. And you didn't know these persons. When you read the legend, you see that it was a boy, 16-year-old adolescent from ISIS. And when you see the image that challenge your narrative, what you knew about ISIS, you see a teenager with all the body burned, all fragile, vulnerable human being, as any human being is. This is what this type of challenge actually we have to bring back in our literature, is to challenge, is really disconstruct the stereotypes and show what is behind the stereotypes, and how the same questions, how that boy, 16-year-old boy, was in the hospital in the middle of a war, being treated by a Kurdish soldier, that it was a rival in the war, and that there was a connection moment between the soldier treating the burden that picture had so many narratives going far beyond to what you know about the ISIS and the war. In one picture, you could capture a lot of narratives. So in my writing, I try to bring this picture back. So Ayelet, would you like to say something, or you can go to the last question? Do you have anything to add about this question?
No, I'm still shocked by the picture that Adriana just described. I think I will need a few minutes.
Ok, então vamos lá.
I will send to you the picture, Ayelet, for you to get to know. So in order to finish up, the conversation was very productive and called me attention, this post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think it's impossible not to have the parallel that you are facing now in the world. I think you had in Brazil, you had 180,000 deaths. You have more than 1.5 million, almost, I would say. You have 8 million of infected people. And what Google shared these because so how you can be an ally. It was searched in 2020, then an influencer. The search, how you can donate and how you can save money. And how you can change the world was searched more than to go back to normal. And then I have the question for Ayelet and Adriana, according to your experiences and in your background experience, this solidarity and empathy that you said, that this image Adriana captured, and you can have in these acute moments, they are present, especially you, Ayelet. So how they can remain in the post-traumatic period? How can you retain it? How you can have this empathy and solidarity, they can go after these critical situations, and what kind of stories that you can bring in your experiences that can help us to face in this time post-pandemic, we hope.
I think
Ayelet, can you start?
I think times like these are the times when you see the human character in its worst and in its best aspects. Albert Camus, in his novel The Plague, writes about how an imaginary town deals with a plague. And he raises this existential question: when things start to fall apart, are we wolves to one another or are we humans to one another? Because I think extreme times like the times of the pandemic are times that really put a mirror in front of our face as individuals and as society, as a culture. What do we do when things go wrong? Are we there for one another when things go wrong? Or do we turn into wolves? And I think that you see all sort of human behavior manifested in this period of time, just like you could see it in previous catastrophes, in war times, in times of challenge, of the humanistic challenge, of can we stay humans even in the most terrible times. And I think that at least in Israel, and I'm sure that also in Brazil, moment of real grace, moment of people getting out of their comfort zone to actually help and endorse other people. And at the same time, you find terrible moments. You find moments of racism, of how we treat the lower economic status people, and how people here blame them for spreading the disease. And I think you can find both. This is what Camille says, that in the times of the plague, you find things to admire in men, and you find things to despise in mankind. And I think we find both.
Eu acho que também pouco
Again, in this line of thought, the experience that I have in covered of conflicts and crises, I was in Haiti after the earthquake, and I had in another humanitarian crisis. You talk a lot about death. That is important to honor these people that left many of their lives in the pandemic that could have been saved. And you know how 10 months, it never changed. The recommendations were the same in the very beginning. You know how to avoid it. Maybe not all of them, because it's a difficult virus, but some lives could be saved, and you have to honor these lives that passed away. But there are a lot of life in all these places. You have a lot of moments of life. When I went to Syria, when we had suffered attempt of a war, for the photographer and I, we stayed there longer, but our translator was in that situation, worked with us because he was in love with the neighbor, and her father could be refugees if they got married. And in order to get married, he needed money. He was a student of languages, British and language, and he was working as a translator in order to have money to get married. So you have a lot of life and survival. The instinct of survival is always calling my attention in these extreme situations, how people live and survive and overcome those situations. And during pandemic in the slums where the state, there is no state in the slums. There is no government helping them. So the solidarity, the this feeling of connection, the feeling of belonging, they are stronger together. It comes from the outskirts, so the country of where the elite refugees to have walls instead of bridges. It's not possible in the slum. So people are more connected. They can realize that they can get stronger if they are together. And this is beautiful. I like it very much, the sentence that say the slum is not a problem, the slum is solution, because the slums came from a solutions, informal solutions, because they didn't have land, they didn't have light, they didn't have a house, they didn't have fresh water, so they could find solutions informally and independently, aside from the negligence of the states, could find for their lives, and they live and survive like this in a situations that should not take place at all. But the survival is their merit of the solution that they found, and the solutions that they can cope with. And the pandemic is showing us the same. So how the solutions, how you saw these solidarity actions in that places that traditionally are solidarious. And besides that, you talked about the research of allies, donations, changing the world that you see in Google. Pandemic are more concerned about that because the virus is very democratic. There is no color, no social class, no nationality. The virus affects everyone, and people, of course, people that have no deviations of personality, that Ayelet knows more than us, and you see people that are human, and obviously they realize themselves in the pandemic more human, so vulnerable as any persons, even though the outskirts, the low-income people suffer more because they have other thing in this pandemic that happened that should not have been like this, but the way it is, if you see the positive thing, these people are not invisible anymore, because when the elite with the privilege they were at home, they could be, these were the people that took care of the public services. You could see them again. I believe so. We human beings, not people with a personality deviation that cannot have empathy with anyone. With besides all these deaths, you have a life and you have lessons to learn in this pandemic. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Deeply, Ayelet and Adriana, for these conversations. You have a lot of questions. I would love to stay 1 hour and a half with you, but time is over, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Instituto Brasil-Israel, Flip and Marília, for the conception of the table and the invitation. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you.
תודה רבה, שלום.